Kevin McCarthy arrogantly tries to outsmart Crockett, the ending left. Everyone speechless. Target word count, 3,800 words. Kevin McCarthy walked into the House Oversight Committee hearing room on that Tuesday morning the way a man walks into a place he believes he already owns. His jacket was perfectly pressed, his smile calibrated for the cameras positioned along the gallery wall, and his entire posture communicated a very specific message to everyone watching. This would be easy. He had spent 34 years in Congress. He had been Speaker of the House. He had negotiated with presidents, managed caucuses, and survived 12 separate challenges to his leadership. The woman sitting 3 chairs down from the chairman, the freshman representative from Texas who had been in Congress less than 2 years, was not someone he considered a threat. He had made that clear the week before when a reporter asked him about her upcoming questioning. "She's got a lot of energy," he had said with the kind of indulgent smile usually reserved for children showing their crayon drawings to adults. "I'm sure she'll learn how things work eventually." The condescension wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Jasmine Crockett had been listening to men like Kevin McCarthy her entire professional life. Men who mistook her youth for inexperience, her directness for naivete, her preparation for luck. She sat perfectly still as McCarthy took his seat at the witness table, her hands folded on top of a stack of 3 burgundy folders arranged with geometric precision in front of her nameplate. Her expression gave away nothing. McCarthy glanced at the folders briefly, then looked past her toward the chairman, already planning his opening remarks in his head. He did not understand yet that those folders represented 14 months of work, 643 pages of documentation, and the complete demolition of every public statement he had made about his role in the January 6th investigation cover-up. He would understand soon enough. Chairman Comer opened the hearing with the standard procedural language, reading McCarthy's biography into the record as if anyone in America didn't already know who he was. McCarthy smiled pleasantly throughout, nodding at the appropriate moments, his hands resting comfortably on the table in front of him. When Comer finished and yielded to McCarthy for his opening statement, the former speaker leaned forward into the microphone with the easy confidence of someone who had done this particular performance hundreds of times before. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who had built a career on appearing reasonable while saying nothing of substance. "I appreciate the opportunity to address the concerns that have been raised about my conduct during the certification debate and the subsequent investigation. Let me be absolutely clear from the outset. I acted at all times in accordance with my constitutional duties, my institutional responsibilities, and my personal commitment to transparency and accountability. Every decision I made during that period was guided by those principles. Every action I took was documented, reviewed, and executed in full compliance with House rules and federal law." He spoke for 7 uninterrupted minutes, his tone measured and authoritative, his argument structured around 3 core claims that he returned to again and again like a well-rehearsed chorus. First, that he had cooperated fully with all legitimate oversight requests. Second, that any communications he had withheld were protected by institutional privilege designed to preserve the separation of powers. And third, that the entire investigation into his conduct was fundamentally partisan in nature, designed to distract from more important work. The performance was polished, professional, and completely hollow. McCarthy knew how to fill time with words that sounded substantive but meant nothing, how to create the impression of transparency while revealing nothing at all. He concluded with a line he had clearly prepared in advance, leaning back slightly and allowing a note of weary dignity to enter his voice. "I have spent my entire adult life serving this institution and the American people. I will not allow my record to be distorted by those who seek to weaponize oversight for political advantage." He held the pause just long enough for it to feel meaningful, then nodded to indicate he was finished. The room was quiet for perhaps 3 seconds after McCarthy completed his statement. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned forward into her microphone, adjusted it downward by half an inch with the kind of precise, unhurried movement that suggested she had all the time in the world, and spoke in a voice so calm it was almost unsettling. "Thank you for that statement, Mr. McCarthy." Her tone was polite, professional, and contained not even a trace of the emotion a reasonable person might have felt after listening to 7 minutes of evasion delivered as principle. "I appreciate your willingness to testify today. I'm going to ask you some questions about your cooperation with oversight requests and I want to make sure we establish a clear factual baseline before we proceed. She opened the first folder without looking down at it, her eyes remaining on McCarthy's face. On December 12, 2022, the January 6th Select Committee formally requested your voluntary testimony regarding your communications with then-President Trump on January 6, 2021, and in the days that followed. Is that correct? McCarthy shifted slightly in his chair, his expression neutral, but his shoulders already tightening in a way that suggested he understood something had changed in the room. The committee made a request, yes, but I had serious concerns about the legitimacy of that committee and its authority to compel my testimony, so I declined to participate in what I viewed as a fundamentally flawed process. Crockett nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer she had expected. You declined. Okay, let's talk about that decision. You stated in your opening remarks that you cooperated fully with all legitimate oversight requests. Is that still your testimony? McCarthy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I cooperated with all requests that respected institutional norms and constitutional boundaries. Something in Crockett's expression shifted then, something that was not quite a smile but carried the suggestion of one, the way a blade catches light before it falls. She reached for the second folder and opened it with a movement so deliberate it seemed choreographed, the paper inside crackling faintly in the otherwise silent room. Mr. McCarthy, I have here a letter dated November 15, 2021, sent from the Office of the Inspector General to the House Oversight Committee. This letter was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the nonpartisan watchdog group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics. The letter details an internal complaint filed by 3 career staff attorneys within the House Counsel's office, all of whom expressed concerns about your refusal to preserve certain communications related to January 6th, despite explicit preservation orders issued by the Select Committee. She paused, letting the words settle over the room like sediment. Were you aware that such a complaint had been filed? McCarthy's face did not change, but his hands moved from their relaxed position on the table to the armrests of his chair, his fingers gripping the wood. I was not aware of the specifics of any such complaint, no, but I can tell you that my office preserved all materials we were legally required to preserve. Crockett turned a page in the folder, her movements unhurried. That's interesting because according to this complaint, your office was explicitly instructed on November 8, 2021, to preserve all communications between your office and the White House from November 2020 through January 20, 2021. That instruction came directly from the Select Committee's legal counsel, and according to these 3 staff attorneys, your office deleted approximately 247 emails from that period on November 10, 2021, 2 days after the preservation order was issued. The silence that followed was not long, perhaps 5 seconds, but in those 5 seconds, the entire atmosphere in the room transformed. McCarthy's expression finally cracked, something sharp and defensive replacing the polished confidence he had carried into the hearing. That is a gross mischaracterization of what happened. Those emails were deleted as part of a routine archival process that had been scheduled months in advance. It had nothing to do with any preservation order. Crockett nodded again. That same slow, deliberate nod that communicated she had heard him and found his answer insufficient. A routine archival process, scheduled months in advance. Do you have documentation of that schedule? McCarthy hesitated. I would need to consult with my former staff to provide specific documentation. And there it was, the first admission that he did not have an answer prepared, that something in this exchange was not going according to the script he had written in his head. Crockett reached for the third folder, and the small metallic sound of the clasp opening was somehow ominous, a sound that promised nothing good. She removed a single sheet of paper, placed it on the table in front of her, and spoke without raising her voice even slightly. This is an internal memo from your Chief of Staff dated November 9, 2021, 1 day after the preservation order was issued and 1 day before those emails were deleted. The subject line reads, Immediate action required, committee request. I'm going to read you the second paragraph, Mr. McCarthy. Per our discussion this morning, we need to clean up anything that could be misinterpreted before the committee formalizes their document requests. Priority items flagged for immediate removal. All WhatsApp threads with POTUS staff, email chains objection strategy, and any materials referencing alternate elector discussions. Standard archival justification applies." End quote. The room went completely silent. Not the performative silence of people waiting politely for someone to finish speaking, but the profound, disbelieving silence of people watching something collapse in real time. McCarthy's face had gone from composed to rigid, the color rising in his cheeks in a way that no amount of camera-ready polish could disguise. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. That memo, I would need to see the full context of that communication to respond appropriately. A single paragraph taken out of context can be deeply misleading. Crockett's expression did not change. "Of course. I have the full memo right here if you'd like to review it." She slid the paper across the table toward him with the gentleness of someone handling a live grenade. McCarthy did not reach for it. He stared at the paper as if it might detonate if he touched it, and for perhaps 10 seconds he said nothing at all. 10 seconds. 15. 20. The only sound in the room was the faint mechanical whir of cameras repositioning, the soft rustle of reporters' notebooks. McCarthy's hands were still gripping the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white against the dark wood. Finally, he spoke, and his voice had lost all of its earlier warmth and authority, replaced by something flat and defensive. "I don't recall that specific memo. I don't recall authorizing any such action." Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it more devastating. "You don't recall? That's your testimony?" She did not wait for an answer. She reached back into the third folder and removed a second document, this one marked with yellow highlighter on several lines. "This is a text message thread between you and your Chief of Staff sent on November 9th, 2021 at 11:47 p.m. You wrote, and I quote, 'Make sure we're clean before they can formalize anything. Use the archival cover. Get it done tonight.' Your Chief of Staff responded, 'Understood. It is standing by.' You responded, 'Good. This never happened.'" McCarthy's face had gone from flushed to pale, the transformation happening so quickly it was almost alarming. He leaned forward suddenly, his voice rising for the first time since the hearing began. "Where did you get that? Those are private communications. You have no right to those messages." Crockett's expression remained perfectly neutral. "These messages were provided to the House Oversight Committee by a career IT specialist in the House administrative offices who became concerned about being asked to participate in what he believed might be obstruction of a congressional investigation. He retained copies of the deletion logs and associated communications and provided them to the Inspector General. The Inspector General then provided them to this committee as part of an ongoing investigation into potential violations of federal record-keeping statutes." She paused, and in that pause, McCarthy seemed to realize that he had walked into something far more comprehensive than he had imagined. "So just to be clear, Mr. McCarthy, your testimony is that you don't recall instructing your staff to delete emails 2 days after receiving a preservation order, despite the existence of a memo from your Chief of Staff detailing exactly that plan, and despite text messages from your own phone confirming that you personally authorized the deletion." McCarthy's hands left the armrests and came up in a gesture that looked almost like supplication, his voice taking on a strained quality that suggested a man trying very hard to maintain control. "I acted on the advice of House counsel regarding what materials were subject to preservation and what materials were considered routine communications outside the scope of any legitimate oversight authority. That's what any reasonable person in my position would have done." Crockett let that answer sit in the air for a moment, and then she did something unexpected. She smiled, not with triumph or mockery, but with something that looked almost like pity. "That's an interesting defense, Mr. McCarthy. Let's talk about the advice you received from House counsel." She opened a section of the third folder that had been marked with a green tab and removed a stapled packet of papers. "This is a legal memorandum dated November 7th, 2021, authored by the then General Counsel of the House of Representatives. The memo was sent to your office in response to your request for guidance on the Select Committee's preservation order. I'm going to read you the conclusion section, which appears on page 4. She adjusted her reading glasses slightly and began to read in that same calm, measured voice. "Based on the foregoing analysis, it is the opinion of this office that all communications between the Office of the Minority Leader and executive branch officials from November 1st, 2020 through January 20th, 2021 fall within the scope of the Select Committee's preservation order. No exception for routine archival processes applies to materials subject to an active preservation order. Deletion of such materials after notice of the preservation requirement would constitute a violation of House Rule 8 and could expose individuals involved to criminal liability under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Preservation must be immediate and comprehensive. Crockett looked up from the memo, and her eyes found McCarthy's face with the precision of a laser designator. That was the legal advice you received, Mr. McCarthy, not advice telling you that deletion was permissible. Advice explicitly warning you that deletion would be a federal crime. The room had gone so quiet that the sound of someone's pen dropping 3 rows back echoed like a gunshot. McCarthy's mouth opened and closed twice without producing sound, his face cycling through expressions too quickly to catalog: confusion, anger, fear, calculation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I relied on my staff to interpret that guidance and implement appropriate protocols. Crockett nodded slowly, and then she asked the question that everyone in the room suddenly understood had been the destination all along, the trap that had been set from the moment she opened the first folder. Mr. McCarthy, did you or did you not personally instruct your staff to delete emails after receiving explicit legal advice that doing so would constitute a federal crime? The silence that followed was absolute. 5 seconds, 10, 15, 20. 23 seconds of a former Speaker of the House, a man who had spent 3 decades in Congress, a man who prided himself on his political acumen and his mastery of institutional procedure, sitting completely frozen in front of congressional cameras with his mouth slightly open and no words coming out. Somewhere in the press gallery, a camera shutter clicked, and the sound seemed to break whatever paralysis had gripped McCarthy's ability to speak. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping backward across the floor, with a harsh screech that made several people in the gallery flinch. I came here in good faith to answer questions, not to be subjected to. This is a partisan witch hunt masquerading as oversight, and I will not participate in it any further. His voice had risen to something approaching a shout, all pretense of measured professionalism abandoned. He reached for the microphone clipped to his jacket and fumbled with it for several seconds, his hands shaking just enough to be visible to anyone watching closely. The clip wouldn't release immediately, and the 3 or 4 seconds he spent struggling with it while standing in rigid silence somehow made everything worse. The physical manifestation of a man whose control had completely dissolved. When the microphone finally came free, he dropped it on the table with a dull thud and turned toward the door at the back of the hearing room. Mr. McCarthy. Crockett's voice was not loud, but it stopped him mid-stride, one hand already on the door handle. Mr. McCarthy, you're still under oath. He did not turn around. His shoulders were rigid, his hands still gripping the door handle, and for a long moment it seemed entirely possible that he would simply leave without another word. But something in Crockett's tone, that same calm, implacable tone she had maintained throughout the entire hearing, seemed to reach him even through whatever emotional state had driven him to stand and attempt to flee. He turned slowly, his face a careful blank that looked like it was costing him enormous effort to maintain. I have nothing further to add. Crockett looked at him for 3 full seconds without speaking, and then she spoke directly to Chairman Comer without breaking eye contact with McCarthy. Mr. Chairman, I move that this committee refer the testimony and evidence presented today to the Department of Justice for investigation of potential violations of 18 U.S.C. Section 1519, obstruction of justice, and 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, false statements to Congress. She finally looked away from McCarthy and toward the stack of folders on the table in front of her. I also move that this committee issue a formal finding that the witness's testimony today constitutes material misrepresentation of his conduct and his compliance with congressional oversight, and that the record reflect his refusal to answer direct questions regarding conduct for which substantial documentary evidence exists. Chairman Comer, who had been silent for the past several minutes, looking almost stunned by the turn the hearing had taken, cleared his throat. The motions are noted and will be considered in executive session. Mr. McCarthy, you are excused. McCarthy left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than if he had slammed it. The moment he was gone, the room erupted in sound. Reporters shouting questions to each other, committee members leaning toward their staffers, the camera operators repositioning for reaction shots. Through it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, her hands folded again on top of those three burgundy folders, her expression revealing nothing at all. The hearing continued for another 40 minutes as other committee members asked follow-up questions and entered additional materials into the record. But everyone understood that the substance of the day had already occurred. What remained was procedural cleanup, the formal architecture required to transform what had just happened into an official congressional record. But the image that would dominate the news cycle for the next 72 hours, the clip that would be shared across every social media platform and replayed on every cable news network, was already captured. Kevin McCarthy, former Speaker of the House, standing in rigid silence for 23 seconds, unable to answer a simple yes or no question about whether he had committed a federal crime. And sitting across from him, perfectly composed, perfectly prepared, was the freshman representative he had publicly dismissed as someone who would eventually learn how things work. She had learned, apparently, quite a bit more than he had anticipated. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Department of Justice announced the opening of a formal investigation into McCarthy's conduct regarding the deletion of materials subject to congressional preservation orders. The announcement came on a Thursday afternoon, buried in a press release that also mentioned two unrelated investigations, but reporters who had been following the story knew exactly what it meant. The legal memorandum Crockett had read into the record, the text messages she had entered as evidence, and the IT specialist's testimony about being instructed to delete emails, all of it had been referred to DOJ prosecutors who specialized in obstruction and false statement cases. McCarthy's attorney released a statement calling the investigation politically motivated and expressing full confidence in his client's eventual exoneration, but the statement had the desperate quality of something written by someone who understands they are playing a losing hand. The charges, if they came, would not be filed for months, perhaps not for more than a year. Federal investigations move slowly, deliberately, building cases with the kind of methodical patience that drives cable news producers insane. But the damage to McCarthy's reputation, to his political future, to his ability to present himself as the reasonable adult in any room, that damage was immediate and comprehensive. The recording of the hearing was watched more than 18 million times in the first 72 hours after it was posted to YouTube. The 23-second silence became a standalone clip that circulated independent of the full hearing, often with the simple caption, "Watch what happens when Kevin McCarthy can't answer one simple question." It was shared by people who had never watched a congressional hearing in their lives, passed along in family text threads and Facebook groups, forwarded with subject lines like, "You have to see this," and "I can't believe this is real." The visceral satisfaction of watching a powerful man who had spent decades avoiding accountability finally be forced to sit in silence, unable to escape or deflect or charm his way out of the corner he had backed himself into, that satisfaction transcended normal partisan lines. Even people who had no particular opinion about Kevin McCarthy or January 6th or congressional oversight found themselves watching the clip multiple times, drawn to the raw human drama of watching someone's carefully constructed facade crack and collapse in real time. For Jasmine Crockett, the hearing represented something more complex than a simple political victory. In the days that followed, she gave several interviews, and in each one she was careful to frame what had happened not as personal triumph, but as institutional accountability finally functioning the way it was designed to function. "This wasn't about me versus Kevin McCarthy," she said in an interview with a Texas news station 3 days after the hearing. "This was about whether powerful people can delete evidence of potential crimes and face no consequences. The answer, I hope, is no. They can't. Not anymore." But anyone watching her deliver that answer, watching the steel behind her eyes and the absolute certainty in her voice, understood that it was also, on some level, about the dismissive comment McCarthy had made months earlier, about the condescending way he had treated her not as a colleague, but as a child who would eventually learn her place. She had learned her place. And then she had used it to destroy him. The folders remained on the witness table for several minutes after McCarthy left, sitting in their neat stack as committee members debated the proper procedure for entering them into the official record. Crockett finally gathered them up herself, placing them carefully into a leather briefcase that sat on the floor beside her chair. The 3 folders, burgundy leather with brass corners and hand-stitched binding, had cost her $412 from a specialty stationery store in Dallas. She had bought them specifically for this hearing, understanding that in a world of digital documents and laptop presentations, there was something psychologically devastating about physical evidence, about folders that could be opened, documents that could be placed on a table, papers that made sound when they were handled. The folders were a prop, yes, but they were also a weapon, carefully chosen and expertly deployed. Every element of the hearing had been choreographed with that same level of strategic precision. The calm tone, the measured pacing, the incremental revelation of evidence designed to give McCarthy multiple opportunities to tell the truth before the final trap question landed. The decision to read the legal memo out loud rather than simply reference it. The choice to let the silence stretch to 23 seconds rather than interrupting it or moving on. None of it was accidental. All of it was the product of 14 months of preparation by Crockett and a team of 3 junior staffers who had worked nights and weekends building the evidentiary chain that would leave McCarthy no avenue of escape. They had known from the beginning that McCarthy would lie. They had known he would claim cooperation while having destroyed evidence. They had known he would retreat to claims of institutional privilege and partisan motivation. And they had built the hearing structure specifically to dismantle each of those defenses in sequence, each piece of evidence chosen not just for what it proved, but for how it would trap McCarthy into positions from which he could not retreat. The text message,